Hello everyone and welcome back. This is the third video in our family focused webinar series, and today we're looking at some solutions for fussy eating. So I'm sure we've all dealt with fussy eating at some point in our lives, whether it's our own kids, someone else's kids, or even just remembering how picky we were when we were younger. So in this webinar, we're going to be looking at what fussy eating is, why it happens, and what we can do to overcome it, because it can be very, very frustrating for parents to have to deal with. So let's get straight into it. So let's begin by taking a little look at what fussy eating actually is. So, fussy or picky eating is when someone, regardless of their age, is selective about what they eat. Now, the level of fussiness, for want of a word, varies, and it can apply to different types of foods, sometimes with a clear reason, for example, texture they don't like, or even a colour they don't like, or sometimes there's not. Sometimes there is just no rhyme nor reason for it. And the number of foods which we are fussy about can also be different. So, for some people, this might be one or two, and for others, it can be more than this. So, should we be worrying about fussy eating? So, there are two sides to this argument. On the one hand, fussy eating can be an entirely normal part of growing up, and it can very much play a normal role in childhood and teens, well, during teenage years, developing those lifelong food preferences. It can be a transient phase, and it can pass us by after a while. And the reason that it happens is because we're actually evolutionarily programmed to reject certain tastes. So, what I mean by this is that in our brains, we are deep rooted to reject certain tastes, in particular, bitter tastes and sour tastes. Now, this is because back when we used to be hunter gatherers, a bitter or a sour taste signaled to us that a food might be unsafe to eat, for example, underripe berries. And it means that it causes difficulties in modern day because we still carry that response with us. So it can be very difficult to get children to eat bitter vegetables in particular, such as broccoli or kale, because similarly, children don't tend to like black coffee, for example, because these carry these bitter or potentially sour tastes. And I mean, even as adults, we're often hesitant to try unfamiliar foods. So, for example, I don't think any of us would go to France and eat frogs or snails for the first time without even the tiniest bit of skepticism. And you might want to smell it first, or lick it, or maybe poke it with a fork. And that's the sort of behaviours we tend to see in children who are fussy eating when they're met with an unfamiliar food as well. So, even though fussy eating can be so frustrating as a parent, it's really important to remember that it's actually coming from one of our brain's most deep rooted protection mechanisms. So, that's a key point that we need to take from today. That being said, in some circumstances, fussy eating can be more serious. So, it's really important that you do speak to a GP or a dietitian or your health visitor if you're concerned about someone you love's fussy eating. In particular, if they're only accepting a very, very limited number of foods, or if selective eating is impacting growth, development, and well being, it's really important that you seek professional, individualized support for this. So, here at Good Food Family, we really like to focus on what we can do about these things. So, what can we do about it? And here I'm just going to quickly link back to the first webinar, if you remember, when we spoke about what balance really looks like. And this here is the Eat Well guide. So we're going to delve into some fussy eating strategies in a moment, but just before that, we need to remind ourselves that regardless of the level of fussy eating that we are experiencing, what's most important is that we continue to push and we continue to provide our families with a diet that matches what the Eat Well guide recommends. So we'll get onto why in just a moment, but I've drawn a little arrow here, and this is to show that mostly fussy eating happens in the fruit and vegetables section. So that's not to say that all of it does, but this is a very common challenge at the dinner table. So regardless, it can happen in any category, but it's really important to keep offering a diet that matches the Eat Well guide. So, what can we do to help reduce and combat fussy eating? Well, first of all, let me introduce you to the brave broccoli. Now, he's going to be the centerpiece of all my examples today because he's a very common vegetable in the UK. He's on a lot of our dinner plates. He's packed of goodness, but there's loads of ways to cook him as well. But he's often the focal point of fussy eating. So today we are labeling him as our learning to love food. And the reason that he is a learning to love food for so many children is because he is a bitter vegetable, which means that he does present these challenges at meal times, linking back to what we just said about bitter vegetables and that innate programming that we need to reject those tastes because it might be dangerous for us. But the good news is that there are many strategies that we can try to help combat fussy eating. And the key is to really focus on playing the long game. And what we mean by this is it can be really easy to be completely caught up in what our family is eating during this very meal on this very day. But when it comes to tackling fussy eating as a whole, we really need to zoom out or step back and consider the bigger picture. And what is this bigger picture? And this bigger picture really comes down to what your family would consider their normal and familiar food environment. So, is that food environment one which is made up of lots of variety, lots of fruits and vegetables at every meal, and is it a safe place to try unfamiliar foods? Or is it one where pot noodles for breakfast, lunch, and dinner is a common occurrence? As well, is it an environment that is supportive and enjoyable, or is it one that's full of conflict and stress? Now, this idea of familiarity is just underlined there, and that's because this is really key. And that's a point we'll keep coming back to onto today. So, with this in mind, I'm just going to give you 10 seconds to have a little think about your food home environment. So, you're welcome to pause the webinar here if you'd like, and just have a think about if you had to ask your family, what is the familiar food environment to them? How might they describe it? How might you describe it? And using these little arrows as prompts to think about what is normal for your family. Okay. So, why is this food environment so important? So, the reason that this is really important is because this familiarity is one of the biggest drivers in developing our future food preferences. And what we mean by that is that if we're exposed to these healthy habits and these healthy environments as a child, we are far more likely to fall into these similar healthy habits as an adult. So, what we mean by this really is that if your family makes meals from scratch with plenty of vegetables available and it's a positive food environment, once children grow up and they go to university or they kind of become independent adults, they are far more likely to fall back on these habits when they come to living on their own and supporting themselves. Because that is what feels familiar and that is what feels safe. In a similar way, if you're raised in a household where it's pot noodles are the norm, this will be the habit that you fall back on as an adult. In a similar way, if you've got a mealtime environment which is stressful, this can actually discourage food acceptance, whereas a supportive environment can encourage food acceptance. So, when it comes to really focusing on our efforts on kind of what we can do, where we can put all that energy when it comes to tackling fussy eating, that's why we're saying try to zoom out, try to see the bigger picture. It's more about creating that healthy environment whereby happy, healthy eating is the norm and that is supported rather than being really particular and making sure that everybody gets at least two pieces of broccoli during, like in them, in this very meal at this very point in time. So just take that step back and zoom out. And as part of this strategy, there are plenty of individual strategies that we can adopt to tackle fussy eating in the short and long term. So let's dive into those now. So, the first thing to remember is that repeated exposure is absolutely key in encouraging food acceptance. And just thinking back to what I said before about frogs and snails, that initial kind of the first time you met with it, it'd be a bit, oh, bit skeptical, bit unsure, not sure how I feel about this. And so with more exposures comes more familiarity. So to be presented with broccoli or frogs or snails once that you've never seen before, for broccoli, it's green and it looks bobbly and it might smell funny and it tastes bitter. And so, no, the gut reaction would be, I'm not doing that. It doesn't feel safe. But by the third or fourth time that we met with this, we're a bit less skeptical because we've seen this before, it's more familiar, and it feels more safe. It can take up to as many as 11 exposures for some children to accept certain vegetables. Now, this exposure can be done in two different ways primarily. So for the first, it can be cooked in different ways. For example, steamed broccoli as a side, or you might have it in a curry, or you might have it roasted and all crispy with some paprika. So presenting vegetables with a dip is also a great way to make them more exciting and acceptable to children. So when you talk about this repeated exposure, that exposure can include presenting it in different ways that you can eat it. But another clever way is to expose them in a way when we're not going to eat it. So, for example, if you take a broccoli and you can dip it in some paint, for example, you can make beautiful fireworks on a piece of paper. So, you can use it as a paintbrush, or you could play shop with it, perhaps, really get children interacting that way. So, both in an eating way and a non eating way, both can help to increase that familiarity, making children more likely to actually put it in their mouths and enjoy it eventually come mealtime. And the final point here is that beginning this process and beginning that exposure from the off is best. So, for example, weaning using bitter vegetables is brilliant, but irrespective of age, so whether you're dealing with like you're at weaning stage and you're trying to get your toddlers onto bitter vegetables, or whether you're dealing with adolescents and teenagers, the sooner the better because it will help taste their taste buds to adapt and accept these bitter flavors, which are the most challenging flavors. But that goes for even non-bitter vegetables, for example, carrots. If they don't like carrots, you can keep that exposure, more familiarity, increased likelihood to try it and enjoy it. It's also important to offer praise wherever we can. So praise anything that they experiment with. So for example, whether it's just poking it, maybe smelling it, or even licking the food, but they've not eaten it yet. This praise helps to encourage children to take that next step. So for example, going from smelling it to licking it, and from licking it to eating maybe a little bit, all the way up to food acceptance. And what goes hand in hand with this is focusing on the positives. So you're offering praise, you're already focusing on the positives because this helps to avoid putting pressure on the situation and it reduces the focus on the fact that they haven't eaten it yet. So this focus shift can really help to reduce mealtime frustration for parents, which is common. And where you feel like perhaps there is nothing to praise, they've not done anything, neutral language is appropriate too. So, neutral language is something we're going to touch on a lot more in my next video about building healthy relationships with food. So, you'll have to bear with me on that one. But either way, reducing the pressure and the conflict at the dinner table and replacing this with more positive strategies and more positive language, which is like praising them for what they have done, is absolutely the strategy that we want to be taking. And another strategy is called guided autonomy. And what we mean by this is giving children independent choice, but within predetermined limits set by you. So, for example, you can, if you're serving kind of from the center of the dinner table, you can put a little bit of everything onto their plate, which is the guided part. You're making sure they're having that balanced meal. But you can ask them, how much would you like? That's the autonomy part, and it helps them because they're choosing. They feel like they have more independence and more control. They get to choose how much they want. So this can help them to feel like they have a say in the matter, and it has the added bonus of helping children to understand their hunger signals too. For example, it's likely that as an adult, you're going to put more of a meal on your plate because you're probably going to be more hungry than a child who is much smaller than you and doesn't need as much energy as you do. So annoyingly, I can see that my camera might just be covering that bubble there. But what the grey bubble says is offering lots of variety. So offering plenty of variety ensures that everybody's got options for fruits and veggies. And the idea here is that even if they don't like one, that's okay because a different one is available. And this ties in with offering smaller portions as well. So, what we mean by this is if children are happy, for example, with carrots and sweet corn, so let's call these accepted foods like we've got there, but not broccoli, offering a smaller portion of broccoli alongside the carrots and sweet corn means that you reassure that they're getting vegetables that they already like and they're getting that nutrients that they need, but they're also having that exposure to that learning to love food that they're not quite there with yet. By having this in a smaller amount as well, this takes the attention off it. It takes the pressure off it. It makes it a lot less daunting for them, and it can also reduce the likelihood of mealtime conflicts because the focus is just not on the broccoli at that moment. The broccoli can sit there, perhaps untouched, for a whole meal, but they are becoming more familiar with it, and this is what we want because they're seeing it, they're having that exposure. But offering variety doesn't necessarily have to stop at mealtimes. For example, show them the huge variety of fruits and veggies available at the shops. There's shelves and shelves full of them. So just take them, let them wander around. And maybe you could allow them to choose a new fruit to try each week, a new veg to try each week. Like we say, allow them that autonomy and that independence in making those food decisions. Positive modelling is another somewhat passive way to encourage children to accept unfamiliar foods. So, for example, if you're sat there clearly eating broccoli without a problem and enjoying it, that helps them to understand that the food is safe and it is tasty, and it encourages them to try it without you actually directly having to say something. Now, what we mean by this, it doesn't necessarily mean you having to eat broccoli and explicitly going, yummy, with every mouthful. It can be as passive as smiling or as nodding or engaging in a conversation about like the taste and the texture of the broccoli, and saying that you're enjoying the meal as a whole and saying, "Yep, I would like to eat this again, and this is a safe meal to eat again." And finally, stick to a schedule. So, this is helpful for some children. It might not make a difference to others, but for some children, having that consistent routine around meals and snacks can help with acceptance because they know when to expect food. They know when it's happening. They know that the family are going to sit down together, and it can help with that, with the food acceptance. So, what should we not do? What should we avoid doing? So, we've touched a little bit on this already about trying to not display frustration, as we want to avoid those mealtime conflicts where we can. Instead, like we said, we want to focus on offering praise or using neutral language towards food. So, we want to avoid using negative language around food, but I'll be talking about this more in my next video as well, where we're going to be talking about promoting healthy relationships with food. So, you'll have to bear with me on that one as well. Another thing that we want to avoid is rushing children through their meals. And I think that that's completely understandable because as an adult, if someone was sat there trying to make you rush your dinner, that would be no fun at all. So instead, let children take their time to explore these new foods, give yourself the time to socialize as a family, and just encouraging children to listen and learn their own hunger signals. So when we say our hunger signals, this means when our brain talks to our tummies to tell you that we're full, and this can take around 20 minutes to kick in. So, rushing can also be a one track road to conflict, which we are trying to avoid, but just allowing for the whole family to kind of sit back, listen to their hunger signals, and work with ourselves that way can help to promote food acceptance because it's just a more relaxed environment for everyone. Now, a strategy that we can sometimes fall back on when we're worried about our children not eating enough is to offer alternatives. And this might be different meals or snacks before meals, especially if children are nagging about being hungry. Now, I think that my little camera icon might just be about covering that great box there, but the bottom left says offer alternatives, which is what we're talking about when we talk about snacks too close to meals. So we want to try to avoid offering these alternatives as it can discourage trying new foods. Offering snacks too close to meals can fill children up, it can fill us up, and then we don't want to eat our dinner. So it's best to avoid this. Now, this being said, there is one slight exception to this rule. So, for some parents, offering a starter of fruit or vegetable sticks can help to sort of deal with this because it means that you're reassured that children are eating some fruits and eating some veggies, and it helps them with the hunger that they're feeling so they've not got to wait for dinner. And it also means that you don't need to worry about it during meal times because they've already had some fruits and veggies as a starter, so you know you've got that there. So if that suits you as a family, that is definitely a strategy you can try as it does work for some families. Another thing we should try to avoid doing is using food or bribing our children to eat vegetables. So, for example, we're all guilty of saying if you eat your broccoli, you can have some pudding and things like that. But we should also avoid trying to put pressure through like guilt tripping our children. So, for example, you're so lucky, some children don't even have food, or I've spent ages on this for you, like that's so unfair that you won't eat this. Both of these come back to that mealtime conflict that we're trying to reduce, and they kind of reduce the likelihood of accepting these learning to love foods because they're contributing potentially towards a negative relationship with food, but also towards that kind of negative atmosphere around meal times and that pressure that we want to avoid. So again, with them talking about negative relationships with food, as I already mentioned, my next webinar will be about building a positive relationship with food. So this will come back and we'll talk more about that then as well. And finally, we all know that we should probably be eating less foods which are high in fat, salt, and sugar. But for children in particular who are developing their food preferences, being exposed to these flavors from a young age means they're more likely to develop a preference for these foods. They're really palatable and they're really tasty. But so if they get a flavor for this, they're more likely to then reject less palatable flavors, such as bitter vegetables like our brave broccoli. So, this is why reading food labels is really important when feeding younger children because there are a lot of packaged foods which we might think are healthy, but some of them can be quite high in fat, salt, and sugar. So, for example, some breakfast cereals and some yogurts, particularly those that are advertised to children. And we might be under the false impression that these are appropriate for children because of how they're marketed. But they can actually be quite high in fat, salt, and sugar sometimes. But that is a whole new debate that we're tapping into there. The main take home point from this is to cook from scratch wherever you can because you know how much salt or sugar you're adding. But if it's by a manufacturer, you might not realize how much they've added to these products. So, to summarize, what might this look like? Many of the strategies we've discussed have been geared towards this visual here. So, we're trying to reduce mealtime conflicts and create a positive mealtime atmosphere where vegetable and food acceptance can take place. But it's all well and good me sitting here and giving you these ideas, but what might it actually look like in practice? So, here's some more tangible ideas. So, like we touched on before, just to reiterate that offering foods in the quality and the quantity recommended by the Eat Well guide is really important. And if your child is fussy, making sure to offer that variety helps them to make sure that they won't be missing out on any of the essential nutrients that they need by not eating the foods that they're choosing to not eat. So, like we said, keep offering a diet which reflects the Eat Well guide. This becomes the familiar, healthy default habits when they become an adult. For more information on the Eat Well guide in particular, we have got an Eat Well guide explained guide on our app. So, go and check that out as well. And what might meal times actually look like? So again, I think my camera bubble has got me slightly over the text there, but I will read this out for you. So firstly, it means getting creative with learning to love foods. So like we said, we want the opportunity for that continued exposure and the variety in exposure. So like we said, if broccoli is the difficult vegetable, continually showing the broccoli as much as we can in different ways. So steamed broccoli is in the dish, kind of roasted broccoli as a side, or in a non-food way, playing shop with that, or using it to paint fireworks. Examples like that. Communal family meal times, and I've put timely in brackets there just to kind of tap into what we said about some children benefiting from that routine. So when we eat together as a family, that offers the opportunity to role model, which, like we said, that positive modeling, you showing that you're enjoying it and showing that it's safe to eat. And also, it's a chance to offer praise. So when we said focusing on what they have tried, if they've smelt it or even licked it, it gives you that opportunity to kind of, I wouldn't say watch because that sounds like you're really watching them, but just to keep an eye on their progress and how they're doing. And it's the opportunity for everyone to eat the same meal. So, like we say, if you're going to be positive role modeling, that's really important there because you need to be showing that you're eating the same thing that they are and you're happy to do so. Self-serving, so this is the opportunity for guided autonomy. So and includes smaller portions of learning to love foods. So, for younger children, when we talk about self serving, it potentially would more look like parents kind of popping it on the plate for them and asking how much they want. As children get older, for adolescents, they can use the spoons themselves and self serve their own food, and it helps them to pick how much they want of what they would like. Um, So praise for the steps they have taken, that's what we've just said. So sitting around as a family together, it gives that opportunity. So for things like well done for trying it, I'm proud of you because you actually put some on your plate today. Or even I thought this was an interesting one, just acknowledging that they've kind of praising that they've acknowledged the food is there. So they might say, oh, the texture looks like this, or it's a broccoli, it looks like trees. just acknowledging and praising that they've shown that engagement with their food and engagement with what they're eating in a positive way. Neutral language. So, like I say, we'll tap into this a little bit more in the next webinar, but trying not to steer the conversation towards a negative language where we can avoid it. So, calling biscuits biscuits, saying it as they are rather than treats or referring to them as bad. Um, Talking about listening to our hunger signals. So, I didn't listen to my tummy and now I'm too full, rather than kind of blaming yourself or feeling showing guilt for perhaps eating more than you needed to at that eating occasion. Showing them that if they're full, that's fine. If you're full, that's okay. You don't have to eat anymore. And this is all we've got on the menu today. If you want something else, we'll talk about that next week. Kind of that little deflection from potential mealtime conflicts. But like I say, we'll talk more about this in the next webinar. We're talking a lot more about neutral language there. And just some extra strategies here that can make the mealtime environment that little bit more relaxed and less stressful, because it takes the pressure and the focus and potential pressure off the food. So having low level music on in the background, or potentially like a podcast that you like to listen to as a family and you can sit and talk about it. So it just creates that relaxed atmosphere and it just helps to keep the mealtime conflicts at a low, and you're creating that positive food environment that becomes familiar to them. Letting children choose their own cutlery and crockery, so little wins. Let them have their own food independence. It might make them more willing to then have independence at the table and try foods that they're unfamiliar with in that way as well. And positive mealtime games or conversation starters. So, what we mean by this, I don't mean that everybody sits and plays a game of Monopoly whilst trying to eat their dinner, but just having those conversation starters or like little games that you can play whilst you're having your dinner to support that positive environment as well. They're just some extra strategies you can adopt. And that is it. So I hope this has been really helpful and I hope you've learned lots about some fussy eating solutions today. Thank you so much for joining me. You can find loads more resources on our app, including the guide section, which I mentioned before for the Eat Well guide, and you can read up on all the other topics whenever you would like to. I hope you'll join me for the next episode, which I've already said we're going to be diving into some developing healthy relationships with food. So thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you next time. Bye.